Bonjour and bienvenue to our lectures on the Grands Châteaux from the Loire and the Ile-de-France. My name is David Horn, and I'm the president of the board of directors here at the Alliance Française de Chicago. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Château de Versailles today. And we're in the company of the Chief Heritage Curator, Bertrand Rondot, and the series curator extraordinaire, Russell Kelley. But before we get started, a few tips for those of you who are new to Zoom. You have been muted on arrival, and you will remain muted to avoid sound interference during the talk. We encourage you to communicate with us at any time using the chat line. To find the chat line, you go to the bottom of your screen, and the little icon is right there in the middle. Give it a try and let us know where you are listening from right now. We also encourage you to type your questions on the chat line at any time. They will be answered by our guest speaker at the end of his talk. So please know that you can turn off your video if you wish to at any time. We would also like to remind you that there is still time to brush up on your French before we all get to travel to France again, something we can hardly wait to do. Our spring session at the Alliance Française de Chicago begins April 17th. This series would not have been possible without our lead partner, the Alliance Française de Miami Metro. We also would like to welcome members from our Alliance network in the United States, from the French Heritage Society, as well as participants joining us from Weiss in Paris. Recordings to this series of events will be available for all in our YouTube channel, and that will be announced, and we will let you know when that happens. So now a few words about Russell. A board member of the Alliance Française Miami Metro, Russell Kelley is the curator and moderator of the lecture series on the Grands Châteaux of the Loire and Ile-de-France. He is author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. It is now available on Alliance Française de Miami's website. Russell has lived in France for nearly 30 years and has visited every chateau featured in this series many times since his very first visit to the Loire 50 years ago. À vous, Russell.
Thank you, David. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Bertrand Rondot, who, as David said, has been Chief Heritage Curator at the Château de Versailles since 2011. Among many other works, Bertrand Rondot is co-author of Visitors to Versailles from Louis XIV to the French Revolution. He curated the exhibition of the same name at Versailles in 2017, and then at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2018, which brought together nearly 190 works from Versailles, the Met, and more than 50 lenders worldwide to illustrate what visitors to Versailles encountered at court during the period between 1682 and 1789. 2 weeks ago, we visited the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte with Alexandre Vauguet, where we were introduced to the architect Louis Leveau, the painter-decorator Charles Lebrun, and the landscape art designer André Lenotre. As Bertrand Rondot will explain, the same three geniuses of their respective disciplines collaborated once again in the creation of the Chateau and Gardens of Versailles for Louis XIV. Surely the chateau which best epitomizes the grandeur of the French monarchy. But first, Bertrand Rondot invites us to watch a short film to introduce the magnificent and enormous Chateau and Gardens of Versailles. À vous, Bertrand.
Good evening. Good evening from Versailles. I'm very glad to be with you tonight, and thank you very much for having me. I will give this lecture from Versailles, but as you can see, the backdrop behind me is not very elaborate because I'm the office at Versailles in the building next to the palace called the Grand Commun. We'll mention it later on during my talk. And this is from this place that will be together tonight to start to understand how this huge palace, magnificent palace that we know nowadays, how it started. It was not born like that, of course, as you can imagine, but as it was the evolution from a very simple hunting lodge, actually. And this is the first image that we are going to see. The next, please. If you see on this engraving of the middle of the 17th century, actually Versailles, the Château of Versailles was built not by Louis XIV himself, but by his father, Louis XIII, in the 1620s, 1630s, so in the first half of the 17th century. And it was built as a hunting lodge, so a rather simple chateau. And as a comparison, you have the image of another chateau of the same period exactly, the Château de Versailles near Compiègne, north of Paris. So it gives you almost a precise idea, an image of what the first Versailles at the time of Louis XIII would look like. And it's only around the early 1660s that the fate of Versailles changed dramatically. And there are reasons for that. Why did Louis XIV take interest in this location, this small hunting lodge? There are historical facts and practical facts as well. The first one in the king's life is in 1660, on the 9th of June 1660, the wedding of the king with a Spanish princess from the House of Habsburg, Maria Theresia of Austria, so Spanish cousin of Louis XIV, actually. And eventually, the following year, a boy was born to the new couple, so heir to the throne, and extremely important in France, as you can imagine. And the child, the Dauphin, as he's called, was born on the 1st of November 1661. And in between, the mentor of Louis XIV, Cardinal Mazarin, died in March of that year, 1661. So altogether, it created a new step in the king's life, being freed of his mentor, so deciding to rule by himself, first of all on the political issue, and to embody this new life in a new chateau. And what is important is to understand that the other royal palaces are surrounded by, or partly surrounded by, cities, like in Paris, Le Louvre, the Tuileries, Fontainebleau, Compiègne, so on. And Versailles is the only place where the king could really envision a palace of his own because of the open land. As you can see on this image, in the early 1660s, you have the small chateau of his father, and on the south of it, so on the left hand, a small village, the small village of Versailles with a small church. And this is from this hunting lodge that the first work would be undertaken by Louis XIV and by his architect. You have seen it in Vaux-le-Vicomte, and there was this magnificent reception organized by Fouquet in Vaux-le-Vicomte that really impressed very much Louis XIV. And since the artists who had been working at Vaux-le-Vicomte were also part of the king's household, they were asked, of course, to work in Versailles. And first of all, it's mainly the architect Louis Le Vau, the next image, please, who didn't rebuild the hunting lodge, but just turned it into a sort of a fairy tale house by just adding steeple roofs with gilded decoration and also ancient busts on the facades. And that's what you see in this picture of around 1668. You can see the small square chateau with 2 new wings added in the forefront to create a 4 courtyard. And that's what we can see in the next image. With the plan of the chateau, and in the courtyard in the front, on the left-hand side, new stables, and the right-hand side, a new building for the kitchens. And if we go back to the previous picture, sorry, we can have a look at the village of Versailles on the left side. You see the tower of the church, the belfry of the church, and sooner this village will have to disappear because of the ambition of Louis XIV for his small chateau. So what is depicted here is really the chateau. We can go to the next 2 images. So I mentioned these busts, ancient busts on brackets on the facades, and also vases on the cornice, above the cornice, to create a much richer decor. But in the next picture, seen from the south, as you can see, the location of Versailles is on the top of a hill, a very small hill, but this is a very favorable location, and that's why also Louis XIV liked the place and decided to transform it. So at that time, as you can see, the chateau remains almost as small as it used to be during the time of Louis XIII, and the royal apartments are quite narrow inside. And that's why the main buildings or enrichments are done outside the palace. And actually, we have no view, no image of the interiors of that chateau of the 1660s, done by Louis XIV. The next image, please. And one of the main buildings added to the former chateau is on the northern side, this water tank disguised as the Grotto of Tethys. It's a sort of a jewel built by Louis XIV. As you can see at the top of the building, a water tank, and underneath a grotto in the Italian style with famous groups created by the famous sculptor François Girardon. Maybe the next picture. Here's the entrance to the grotto. You see we are looking north, and at the back of the image, we can see a tower, which is also a water pump for the waters, because as you know, in Versailles, the ambition of Louis XIV for the gardens was from the very beginning to have water plays and fountains, and so there was a need to gather water in big water tanks, very higher up, as high as possible. And the Grotto of Tethys is one example of these water tanks. The facade looks like a triumphal arch with the grille work symbolizing the motto of the king, with the sun, the face of the sun, with the radiating lines, rays from the sun. And if we enter the grotto, one would have seen, the next image please, one of the most famous creation of the time by Antoine Girardon, the famous sculptor. And this is really a masterpiece to understand from that time how Versailles became the key point for the artists working for the king. There were also great construction works all over France, also in Paris, in the Louvre, in the Tuileries, and elsewhere. But Versailles really concentrated from that time onwards the great artists of the time, and especially the sculptures, because we have seen that the architecture is still quite on a small scale. And this group of Apollo and the Nymph is an interpretation of a famous antique sculpture, ancient sculpture, the Apollo Belvedere, that belongs to the Pope in the Vatican Palace. And it's how Girardon interpreted this creation of the antiquity to create this masterpiece of French sculpture for Versailles. The Grotto of Tethys, we'll see later on, will be destroyed, and the group will be moved elsewhere, of course. this is what the chateau looked like at the time of in the 1660s. And as I mentioned, the apartments were quite small and they couldn't accommodate big receptions. And that's why most of the time in those years, in this decade, the receptions that Louis XIV organized in Versailles took place in the gardens. And there are three main court festivities organized there. The first one being Les Plaisirs de l'Île Enchantée, the pleasures of the Enchanted Isle in 1664, from the 7th to the 9th of May 1664, 3 days actually, which were coordinated by a mechanic called Carlo Vigarani. And for all the scenery and the different plays conceived by Molière and Lully, so the great writer and the great musician working for Louis XIV. And this is, in these 3 days, you have a carousel, which is a tradition from going back to the Middle Ages, state a dinner, a comedy ballet, a ball, and a final firework. Actually, only a few hundred guests could attend. No, please go back to the previous one. And there were a few hundred guests only, and more than 3,000 guests or people were blocked at the gate and couldn't enter the gardens of Versailles at that time. So you can see that we are still on a small scale in Versailles. So the next big, the next big reception was called the Grand Divertissement Royal. It was only one day in 1668, on the 18th of June. A long walk took the guests through the gardens from the afternoon to the late at night. With first, and as you can see on the map, on the main aisles of the gardens, temporary buildings were built at the crossing of the aisles for different purposes, for refreshment first. Then a play was performed, a play by Molière again. Then a great dinner was given in an octagonal room, and then a ball, and eventually it finished with a firework. So maybe we can see the following images. This is the final firework. As you can see, with the Château of Versailles as a backdrop for this reception, no one entering the chateau that evening. And the third reception was in 1674 to celebrate the second conquest of Franche-Comté, so an increase in the size of the country. And it was slightly different because it was 6 days over a period of two months. And for these ceremonies, these receptions, it was mainly the architectural beauty of the place that was used, such as the Marble Courtyard of the palace, which is used as a stage. And the next image, we see that it ended with, on the 31st of August, with a firework, and something that was maybe the most amazing, that the whole Grand Canal, this huge span of water on the west of the palace, created by Le Nôtre, was completely surrounded by thousands and thousands of lights, created a fairy vision. But as you can see, we didn't talk much about the Château of Versailles because everything was taking place outside, because Versailles was far too small to house the courtiers, even the royal family. There were not enough apartments in that small chateau for everybody, the king having cousins to accommodate when they follow the court, and not to mention the courtiers, of course. And so a second phase in the history of the palace was what we call the envelope. And this is the last work done by Louis Le Vau for the king before he died. He died in 1668. And so he started in the middle of the 1660s to develop a new idea of a royal palace in France, quite new idea. We'll see it on the map next, on the next image. As you can see at the center, you see the former chateau, which is surrounded on three sides by three buildings of a much grander scale. On the north, that is to say on the right, one wing for the king apartment. On the west, an open space with a gallery and a terrace. And on the left side, on the southern side, the apartment of the queen. Here we see the ground floor, but we'll see the first floor. It might be confusing for you, but in France we say ground floor and first floor. So when I say first floor, I suggest for you it means the second floor, if I'm not wrong. So here we see the French ground floor or first floor for you. Be aware of that. And the next image will show you what this new palace would look like. And like what you have seen of the previous chateau, it's a totally different architecture conceived here by Louis XIV. No brick as it was traditional in the first half of the 17th century, but built totally in limestone, this pale yellow limestone, very elegant from the area near Paris, with also no steep roofs in blue slate, but a hidden roof, a terraced roof behind the balustrade, and a much grander scale with 3 levels. And as you can see here, we are on the western side of the palace, on the garden side. So on the northern side, you would have had the king's apartment, and on the southern side, the queen's apartment, on the first floor, and on the ground floor, the apartment of their son, the Dauphin. And in the other corner, an apartment called the apartment of the bath of the king. Next. So here we see the first floor, so the second floor for you, on the northern side, the king's apartment, with a first room here, guard's room, then an antechamber, then the bedroom, the bedchamber, then a square drawing room in the corner, then facing west, a small private bedroom, and then a cabinet. And then on the west, you have a big terrace with a pond in the middle, a small basin in the middle, then the symmetrical apartment for the queen. And that's how it was planned. And in the former chateau, drawing rooms for the joining the two apartments. But as you can see, in that plan, there is no practical link between the two royal apartments. And from that envelope that was achieved in the middle of the 1670s, very soon a magnificent staircase was added on the king's side to access the king's apartment. And that's what we are going to see in the next image. The staircase of the ambassadors, or the ambassador staircase, built between 1668 and 1674, with a grand decoration and a very specific type of lighting. Due to its position in the palace, it had no direct light, so it would get its light from a skylight, which was quite new at the time and quite spectacular. And therefore, since there was no window in that room, there were fake opening, trompe-l'oeil openings as a gallery surrounding the staircase on the upper level, with people, as you can see, the two small sketches in the lower part of the image, with people from all over the world watching the court life in the staircase. And actually it's symbolizing the 4 continents, the 4 parts of the world as they were known at that time. And here you have an example of the nations of Europe, as well as nations of Asia. There were also the nations of Africa and the nations of America, Oceania being not part of the series at that time. And we will go through the main rooms of the king's apartment with the Venus drawing room, which was next to the staircase of the ambassadors. So a room decorated on this, the king's apartment, like the queen's apartment, was its decoration. The decoration was conceived by Charles Lebrun, with a team of sculptors and painters, and each room being devoted to a god of the antiquity, which corresponds to a planet. And they were centered on the planet Apollo, the sun, because it's, as you know, all the planets are revolving around the sun. And Louis XIV had chosen the sun as his emblem. He explains in his memoirs that the sun, it's what gives life to everything on earth, that like the king in his kingdom. And this is a very beautiful image of the king's power in the country. So after the Venus drawing room, we had the Mars drawing room, which was the guard's room in the king's apartment, and later on would be used as a ballroom with two platforms for musicians on both sides of the fireplace. And you can see here the very elaborate decoration of the ceiling, mixing stucco work, so in relief, in 3 dimensions, as well as trompe-l'oeil images, so to create a very rich impact, with the central part of the ceiling devoted to the god, whose name, giving its name to his name to the room, and on the surrounding paintings, important events of the Roman, of the ancient history, evoking the events in the king's life. The next, please. Then we would see here the Apollo drawing room. There was another room in between, the Mercury drawing room. We'll see it just after, but at the time when the this apartment was conceived, there was an antechamber after the guest room, and then the next image, please, a bedchamber. And this image of the Mercury drawing room today gives you a good idea of what the king's bedroom would have looked like in the middle of the 1670s, with its canopied bed. And what we have completely lost of that Versailles, lost for good, is, with the next image, is the silver furniture. When this envelope and this apartment for the king was created, it was not true in the queen's apartment, but in the king's apartment, all the furniture was in silver, from the antechamber to the king's bedchamber and so on. In every room, most of the furniture was in silver. And when I say silver, it's solid silver. So it's not just silver sheets on a wooden frame, wooden structure. And for example, in the Apollo drawing room, between the 2 windows that you can see on the left, you can hardly see them, there was against the wall a pier table, whose designed by Lebrun is in the lower part, and above it a huge mirror whose frame had been designed also by Lebrun. And you have to know that the table was weighing 350 kilograms of silver, and the frame of the mirror was even more heavy, was even heavier, because it was weighing almost 480 kilograms. In the bedroom of the king, there was a balustrade dividing the room into 2 halves, and between the official part and the private part of the bedroom. And the balustrade was weighing 1 ton of silver. The chandelier as well was in silver, the torches and whatever was in the room was in this metal. Strangely enough, the only piece of furniture which was not in solid silver was the throne of the king himself in the Apollo drawing room. It was in wood covered with silver sheets. But anyway, the impact was, you have to imagine that at that time, Versailles was not made of gold, and but made of the white shine of the silver, of this precious metal. But unfortunately, in 1689, due to the new war starting in Europe, the War of the League of Augsburg, Louis XIV decided to melt down his silver furniture. And even though his ministers and all the courtiers and complained and wanted to prevent the king from sending the silver furniture to the mint, he knew that he had no solution, or the solution was it's part of the silver, of the monetary silver of the kingdom that was used for the silver furniture. And eventually everything was sent to the mint, and they got back 21 tons of silver from the silver furniture of Versailles. But this is something that disappeared even at the time of Louis XIV. But this didn't prevent Louis XIV from moving on and creating from this Italianate palace, square palace with the envelope, to create a new palace of a new scale, when he decided at the end of the 1670s, maybe around 1678, to move the government and the court from Paris to Versailles, and to be able to house the government offices, the courtiers, the court receptions, court festivities, and all the services. The palace, the square palace that had been built till now, was not enough. And that's what we'll see in the next image. You see on this plan of Versailles, you see in the center the square palace called the envelope, linked with the two former kitchen and stables, yes, here. And then in light gray, on the south of the central part and on the north, two very long wings, planned long wings, to create what we'll see in the next image, the Palace of Versailles that we know today. And I'm very impressed by this drawing by Israel Silvestre, because as you can see, he has used the whole width of the sheet of paper, and you see the end of the two wings almost off the image, as if this palace could have been even longer, even bigger. And as you can see, the former envelope is at the very center, stretching out towards in the gardens, and as a backdrop on both sides, you have these two new long wings to accommodate the apartments, the necessary apartments for all the members of the royal family, and especially the princes of the blood, these distant cousins to the king, and also the most important courtiers. Because you have to know that at the time of the greatest moment in the reign, the court was composed of 1,500 courtiers, and there were more than 5,000 people working around, plus all the military. So altogether, it was more than 10,000 people to be accommodated in the palace and around the palace. So you see on this drawing projects drawn of roofs above the central part of the palace that were never built, of course, because the beauty of this architecture, and this is not, as you can imagine, the idea of Louis Le Vau, because Le Vau died in 1668, so 10 years before this new idea came in the king's mind. But the idea was not to increase the size of the palace, to increase its height, but to increase its width, and to create this huge, huge palace, which stretches for more than 600 meters from one end to the other. The next image, please. And on the city side, that created another characteristic of this official palace. This is the recesses, the successive recesses of the courtyards, from the front courtyard to the or avant-court to the royal courtyard, closed by a second grillwork, and then the core of the former palace, of the former chateau, remaining of the time of Louis XIII, over-decorated but remaining still, called the Marble Courtyard, because it had a raised floor covered with marble marble tiles. And this is really typical of this new Versailles. It's not a new idea, but it's the adaptation of these several phases of enlargement of the palace to the original chateau of Louis XIII, which was eventually kept. Louis XIV sometimes was thinking of demolishing the former chateau, the original chateau, but eventually it was kept, and it is still there. The next image, please. And this is the view of Versailles. You have to not look at the chapel on the right because it doesn't exist yet, but there you understand how the capital of how Versailles could become the capital of France, with the palace in the center, with the marble courtyard in the center, the royal courtyard in the front, and the forefront, the avant-cour here. And you can see on both sides the northern wing here and the southern wing here at the back. And in the forefront, you see the official buildings related to the work of the government, with these two wings built for the ministers. And behind the southern wing of the ministers, the Grand Commun, this building for the servants' quarter and the kitchens of the palace. And this is the very building where I'm staying at the moment and where I'm talking to from. So, and Le Grand Commun, so this building is more than 15,000 square meters. So it gives you an idea of the scale of the service at Versailles for the king's household. And in the next image, we see from the other side, looking towards the city of Versailles, which was expanding at the same time. Of course, this former village of Versailles had been destroyed, as I mentioned earlier. You had these two huge horseshoe-shaped buildings built for the horses. And you have to know that more than 5,000 men were working in the stables, and there were more than 2,000 horses housed in the stables here in Versailles. You have on the southern side, on the right side of the picture, the Petite Écurie, the small stables, and on the left-hand side, the Grande Écurie, the great stables. Size-wise, they are more or less the same. They're huge, and it's quite unique in Europe at that time for their magnificence and scale. But the difference between the great and the small stables is that the great stable is where the horses mounted by the king and the royal family are kept, and in the smaller stables are the horses to draw the carriages and the coaches, the coaches of for the ceremonies. And in that picture, we see also that a lot of work is done in the gardens by André Le Nôtre. We see here what next to the garden, so you see on the left the two stables, the horseshoe buildings, then the palace here in the center, and on the western side, the gardens. And you see the difference between an open space here, then the groups, the bosquet, with different fountains, very elaborate fountains, and then a more open land, a more open space linked with the Grand Canal. This, as some people called it, the Sea of Versailles. It stretches for 3 kilometers long here, and which give an axis, the main axis of Versailles towards the west, with the Grand Trianon built on the northern side, a small palace, a private palace built for Louis XIV, and the Ménagerie on the southern side for housing exotic animals. And you can see that the park of Versailles is enclosing a field, as you can see, not only elaborate gardens, but fields and some farmlands as well. and the surrounding wall was 42 kilometers long. And of course, within these 42 kilometers boundary, there were private properties. The king didn't expropriate everybody there. It was not the purpose. It's only for the creation of the main roads, the main aisles, and in the park that the property was bought by the crown. Otherwise, you had private owners, private farmers working within these boundaries. Next image. We have. So in the palace, unlike in the 1660s, court receptions could take place, and Louis XIV organized from 1661 onwards, 3 evenings a week in winter, receptions for the courtiers, but as well as for people invited from Paris or also foreigners. And so the king's apartment was transformed into a series of drawing rooms to host these receptions. Here you had one room was transformed into a buffet room, as you can see, and another one, as you see in the next image, was turned into a billiard room. And these receptions were very important for the courtiers because that evening, it was from 7 to 10 o'clock, the king would act as a private man. So people could talk to him freely. So it was a very privileged moment to be invited to these soirées d'appartement, as they were called. But the main transformation to house the court in Versailles was the creation of the Hall of Mirrors. You remember that we have seen that there was a terrace between the king's apartment and the king's apartment that was not convenient, especially in France, where it rains quite often in the winter months. And that's why it was decided to replace that terrace by a gallery, the Great Gallery, the Grande Galerie, but very soon called the Hall of Mirrors because of its decoration. And that's what we can see in the next image. So really at the center of the palace, this long gallery, which is 75 meters long, so it's one of the largest spaces in France at that time. It's covered, it was designed by Jules Hardouin-Mansart, the architect to the king, who has replaced Louis Le Vau, and also Charles Lebrun, especially for the ceiling. On the walls, you can see that the walls are covered with marbles, and it's a very simple structure, if we can say so, because on the garden side, you have 17 windows, arched windows, which are faced with 17 arches, which are covered with mirrors. And these mirrors were made in France, the newly created manufactory of Saint-Gobain, where they could achieve these very large panes of glass. And thanks to workers who had been stolen, if I can say so, from Venice, and who settled in France, invited by Louis XIV. And you have to imagine that it's very important. One had never seen so many mirrors in such quantity of such a size in a room, in a space. So it was an incredible luxury. And also the visitors, because I will insist on that later on, but Versailles was a public palace open to everybody every day during the daytime. And for a lot of people, it was the very first time when they could see themselves in full length from head to toe in the mirrors of the Hall of Mirrors. So it was an experience for that in its own right. The next image, maybe to evoke the creation of the gallery. These are the first drawings drawn by Jules Hardouin-Mansart and accepted by Colbert, the minister Colbert, in 1678. The theme of the ceiling was not decided from the very beginning. First, it was decided to create a gallery devoted to Apollo, but there is already a gallery for Apollo in the French palace, in the Louvre Palace. So then it was thought of devoting it to Hercules, this ancient hero, which was often associated with the king. And eventually the king decided that it would be his own life that would be depicted on the panels on the vault. And that's what we can see in the next image. With but if it's the own life of the king which is depicted, it's not depicted in the naturalistic form, but with the help of allegories. So the king is dressed as a Roman emperor, an ancient Roman emperor, and surrounded by allegorical figures, as you can see. So these paintings created by Charles Lebrun are very difficult to understand, and that's why labels were added next to the main paintings for the visitors to understand what they would see. We can have a quick look to the next images to see the beauty of the decor. So I mentioned the walls covered with marbles coming from French quarries, except the white marble, because there is no quarry for white marble in France. And as you can see, with a very subtle choice of colors, very light red or brownish red, it's to match with the porphyry vases and porphyry busts that were planned to be displayed in the gallery, as well as these ancient sculptures, 8 of the most important ancient sculptures in the Royal collection displayed in the Hall of Mirrors. The next image to show you some details of this very, very rich decor in the vault. Again, like in the apartment, the king's apartment, with the confusion between trompe-l'œil and stucco work. And strangely enough, this samurai armory of a samurai depicted there in this trophy of Oriental arms, because there was a Japanese embassy that came to Europe between 1613 and 1620, and the ambassador who toured Europe brought, of course, very important presents, and among them samurai armors, and 2 armors were given to Louis XIII, because we are in the early 17th century, and one of them is still in the national collections in France. This is the one you have on the right, and it was depicted on the vault of the Hall of Mirrors, because you have to understand that Versailles is also the place where the king would welcome the world. We can go to the next image, and of course the Hall of Mirrors was used for the main receptions of political importance, like the reception of the Doge of Genoa. It was the first time that the Doge could leave the Republic of Genoa to apologize. There was a crisis between France and Genoa at that time, and so he had to come to Versailles. But he was humiliated on one hand, but very impressed to be received in the Hall of Mirrors. It was the first time the Hall of Mirrors was used for an official ceremony. And you can see on the side of the king, the throne and the silver parts of the silver furniture, especially these huge vases. The following year, in 1686, it was the ambassadors of Siam who came to Versailles. This is the most exotic embassy, but not the only one actually received to Versailles, but Siam was a very important kingdom at that time, a sort of emporium for goods in Asia. And here you have the reception of the ambassadors who were in front of the king at the end of the Hall of Mirrors. So it made a great impact with the beauty of the costumes of the Siamese ambassador. Siam is nowadays Thailand, the Kingdom of Thailand. In 1715, it was the embassy coming from the Persian Shah, the King of Persia, and the ambassador came with his retinue, and as you can see, with a very specific type of turban that would impress the French. And eventually, and for that occasion, the King Louis XIV was a very aged king, It was a few months before he died. Well, in February 1715, he died on the 1st of September 1715. He was already ill at the time, but he was strong enough to decide to have the ceremony in the Hall of Mirrors. And the king, that's not what is not shown on the painting, was wearing a coat covered with diamonds. It was extremely impressive. And the last ceremony, we are in the following reign of the time Louis XV. In 1742, it was the reception of the Turkish ambassador, Said Pasha, the last great ceremony, official ceremony to take place, official embassy, sorry, to be received in the, and as you can see in the next image, since the drawing was supposed to be engraved, I have reversed the image so we can see exactly how, and it's the most precise and the most faithful depiction of the reception of an ambassador. You see with the crowd of courtiers on both sides, the gallery could house about 1,500 courtiers to view these receptions, these official audiences. The next image, Versailles is about sacred spaces, and the sacred spaces actually in the French monarchy are of course religious ones, but also political ones. And unlike in other countries, it's not the throne room. There are throne rooms in French palaces, but the most sacred, the most important, politically speaking, room in the French palace is the king's bedchamber. And that's why the next image, eventually Louis XIV decided to move his apartment first from the northern side, on the left, on the right-hand side, to the former chateau in the center, to the former chateau of Louis XIII. And here, all these rooms around the Marble Courtyard became the new king's apartment, so that the former king apartment could be used for receptions, for court receptions, and could be open every day to the public. And in 1701, he moved his bedchamber to the very center of the palace. And that's what you have on the image. And that's where the audiences would take place, audiences of European ambassadors, of ministers, and so on. And this is the central part of the king's life, everyday life, official life in the palace, and also where the king would eventually sleep. This is one ceremony, a rare depiction of a ceremony there of the Knights of the Military Order of St. Louis received for the first time by Louis XIV in his bedchamber at the center of Versailles. But of course, the other sacred space in Versailles is the chapel. And strangely enough, after seeing so many work being done in Versailles with the envelope, with eventually the building of this huge gallery that you have here, completed, the Hall of Mirrors completed in 1684, the chapel, as you can see, it's on the corner here, on the northern side of the central part of the palace. But as you can see, it's quite small. It's on 2 levels. And to go to the northern wing, which starts here, you have the beginning in dark gray of the northern wing, this huge wing expanding towards the north. To reach the northern wing, one had to cross the chapel every time. Of course, this chapel was a temporary one. It was not appropriate for the palace of the most Christian king, of the Roi très chrétien. And we'll see 2 images of this chapel. And finally, at different time of its building here, as you can see, the walls are not decorated yet. It's not completed with the plain carved walls with ceremonies in 1695. And eventually, in 1701, it's completed with the gilding. And this is the ceremony, the christening of the son of an ambassador, the Venice ambassador. And the king himself was the godfather of the child. And as you can see, everybody is dressed in black because the court was in mourning. But it didn't prevent the court, of course, from organizing this christening for the son of the ambassador. But this chapel was not proper to the palace of Louis XIV, and that's why this is eventually a fifth chapel in Versailles was built between 1699 and 1710. The first plans were in the shape of a Greek cross with a dome towering it, but eventually it was abandoned, and Jules Hardouin-Mansart planned this long nave in the traditional Gothic style, not style, shape, if not style, because the style is the classical style with these Greek Corinthian columns. And as you can see, the chapel has two levels, because in the palace, since the king lives on the first floor, he stays and he attends mass every day and stays on the first floor, and he goes down to the ground floor only for the main ceremonies a few times a year. And as you can see, the picture was taken from the balcony for the king and the royal family at the western end of the chapel. We are looking towards the choir with the altar on the ground floor, and above it you have what should have been where we are staying now, the organ. But the organ case couldn't be above the king and the king's family. That's why it was moved to the eastern end of the chapel above the altar, creating this beautiful movement towards the vault. And as you can see, the chapel is built in plain white limestone, a very fine limestone. It's an extremely elegant building, an extremely elegant space with plain windows with no stained glass, just very plain white panes. And so the lights go through the chapel, whatever the time of the day. There is always an amazing light in this building. So it was. We can see the plan in the next image. You see it not very far from the former chapel, which was eventually turned into a drawing room. This is the chapel and the final chapel of Versailles. And we'll see a depiction of a ceremony there. So here you see it towering. There was a rule in Versailles that no building in the city of Versailles should be higher than the floor level of the Marble Courtyard. And of course, as you know, Palace of Versailles is a flat palace that extends, but that doesn't rise. There is no tower, except the chapel, but it's normal. The house for God is more important than the house for the king. And the following image will show you the main altar in gilt bronze, a masterpiece of the sculptor Van Cleve. And here we have a ceremony during the reign of Louis XV, but you have to imagine the same at the time of Louis XIV, with a ceremony for the Knights of the Order of the Holy Spirit, an order created in 1578, the most important knight orders in France. And this ceremony would take place once a year in the chapel of Versailles, with a special throne for the king, set in the nave at the entrance to the choir. So, and you see at the back of the chapel the platform, the balcony for the royal family, for the everyday mass for the royal family. Yeah, packed with courtiers. The only sacred part, if I can say so, which couldn't be built by Louis XIV, was eventually the opera, the theater hall, which was planned at the end of the northern wing. And this is what you can see on this detail, with these cranes still in action at the end of the 17th century. For financial reasons, this remains like that until Louis XV decided to have the opera built for the ceremonies of the wedding of the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI, and the Archduchess of Austria, Marie Antoinette, in 1770. So between the end of the reign of Louis XIV until 1770, that's what you would see in Versailles, this open construction work at the end of the northern wing. But otherwise, thanks to the enormous work that Louis XIV has undertaken in Versailles. We have the palace that he bequeathed to his heirs, Louis XV and Louis XV, and of course, bequeathed to France. And as you can see symbolically, the gardens of Versailles, conceived by Le Nôtre, expanded by Le Nôtre, are from a very formal central part of the garden with embroideries, platforms, then with the groups, with the bosquet, and then with the more wooded land opening onto the countryside, as if the whole country, the whole France, was integrated into the Palace of Versailles. Thank you very much.
Bravo, Bertrand. That was wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you so much. That wonderful image there shows an enormous park that surrounds Versailles. Just how big is the park today?
It's 40 hectares. The gardens. So it's the inner part is 40 hectares, and it's 3 times the size for the Grand Parc, which is smaller than it used to be at the time of Louis XIV. But thanks to laws, heritage laws in France, the surrounding landscape hasn't been damaged. And there is a law in France that when you have a heritage building, you have to protect the views from that building. So as far as you can look from Versailles, you don't see any modern building. So you see more or less what Louis XIV used to see or could see when he was living there.
Amazing. How would you describe the architectural style of Versailles? What is the best description?
I would say that it's the French version of the great Roman Italianate style, Baroque style of the 17th century. There is a strong influence. The taste of the king actually was formed by Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian cardinal, and who had a strong influence on his on the young king, and also the queen, his mother, the Queen Anna of Austria, the wife of Louis XIII, though she was Spanish, had also a taste for Italian luxury, and that's how the taste of the king was built. And eventually, as you know, Louis XIV, who spoke fluent Italian, invited Cavaliere Bernini in 1665, who was working for the Pope in Rome, to come and work for the king in France. The Pope gave his permission, and eventually Bernini spent a few months in France in the middle of the 1665, giving his advice on different projects conceived by the king. And also he received the commission of 2 sculptures, a bust, which is still which was done while Bernini was in France. So and also an equestrian group that was done in Rome and then delivered much later in, if I'm not wrong, in 1685, that could reach Versailles in 1685.
You mentioned briefly the water situation at Versailles. Is it true that while it's a lovely setting, it did not really have enough water to supply all of the fountains? What does it do to solve that problem?
It's true, because Versailles, as said, is built on the top of the hill, but the hill, as you could see at the time of the small chateau of Louis XIII, was much too small to house this huge palace spanning more than 600 meters. So the hill had to be enlarged and supported by a new orangery. And also in front towards the west of the village, former village of Versailles, there were marshes. So that's why all the waters had to be drained, and therefore the Grand Canal, which was planned quite soon in the plans of Le Vau and Le Nôtre, and expanded to what we know nowadays. So it's also to collect all the waters from these marshes, because Versailles is in a valley opening to the west. But that water is useless because it's at the bottom of the domain. And for the fountains, to play the fountains, you need water coming from higher up. So that's why all the rivers and streams on the hills on both sides of the valley of Versailles were collected. It was an enormous engineer work to study all these réseaux, I don't know how to say that in English, all these networks of natural water networks, and connect ponds, lakes on the top of the hills, and bring the water through pipes to the reservoirs that we saw on the northern side of the palace, the Grotto of Tétis, and with pumps bringing up the water again. And as you know, eventually there are two mad ideas, I would say, is to divert the course of the river, which is a river in Normandy, about 50 kilometers or more than 50 kilometers, sorry, west of, more than 50 kilometers west of Versailles, to divert it and to bring it partly to its waters, partly to Versailles. And there was a huge aqueduct which was built in the valley of Maintenon, about 50 kilometers from Versailles, which was never completed. It was an ambitious project. And so the second project, which was achieved, was what we call the Machine of Marly. It was a huge pump in the river Seine in Marly, north of Versailles, not as far, but then at the bottom of a steep hill, and with a series of pumps and intermediate ponds, the water could be leveled higher and higher to an aqueduct that would eventually lead the water to the water tanks of Versailles, and that did work.
You mentioned as well, you focused obviously on Louis XIV in your presentation, but in your exhibition, of course, you go through 1789, which I guess is when things really changed. Could you just briefly describe what works were undertaken by Louis XV and Louis XVI to bring us up to date?
Mm-hmm. So at the time of Louis XV, you wouldn't see as visitors much in the outside of Versailles because the palace had been built. As I said, Louis XV eventually built the opera at the end of the northern wing, but the main transformations were inside the palace. And this was really, I would say, mad, because almost every year rooms were changed in the palace, in the private apartments. I didn't mention that, but at the time of Louis XIV, there was only one apartment for the king, with a series of rooms partly around the Marble Courtyard, on one side of the Marble Courtyard, sorry, to house the royal collections of paintings of precious hard stone vases, which are now in the Louvre. And these collections, these museums, a series of museums, I would say, in that part of the palace, were eventually removed and taken to Paris for most of them, to official buildings in Paris, to make space for a private apartment for Louis XV. Louis XV couldn't stand the public life that Louis XIV had suffered all his life through. And even though Louis XV knew that he had to perform the ceremonies every day of the lever and the coucher, for example, and that he knew that the palace had to be open to the public, he wanted to have a private apartment, a proper private apartment. That's why instead of this museum, he removed all these collections and created a sort of a private house inserted into the palace. And not only that, but once it was done in the 1730s, once it was done, almost every year a room was changed, a wall was moved. So every year, when the court was not living in Versailles, say mainly in the fall, in autumn, when the court was going to Fontainebleau for several weeks, that's the time when construction work could take place in the royal apartments. And often when the court and the royal family was coming back, it was not completed, and that could create some tension between the king and the administration.
One last question. What restoration work is being undertaken during this confinement period at Versailles?
At the moment, nowadays, yes?
Yes. What can we look forward to when we can get back?
Yes, we have just completed the restoration of the roof of the chapel. Its beams was partly damaged, so it needed really an overall restoration, which is just completed. And on the film that I show at the beginning of the lecture, you could see a big scaffolding enveloping the chapel, unfortunately. So we have to do a new film with a drone with the chapel in its full glory. So that has been done. And we're working, of course, in apartments inside the palace. And at the moment, we're starting the restoration of the apartment of Madame du Barry, the mistress of the last mistress of Louis XV, who had an official apartment in Versailles under the roofs on the northern side of the Marble Courtyard. So this is the main restoration work now to be undertaken.
Well, we look forward to visiting Versailles, hopefully this summer. I would like to
hopefully
give you my sincere thanks and our sincere thanks for your excellent presentation on the Château de Versailles, which truly sets the standard for royal palaces throughout Europe and beyond. So it is fitting that today's lecture concludes our series on the Grands Châteaux of the Loire and the Ile-de-France. And to paraphrase your predecessor last week, Guillaume Foncanel, when talking about the Louvre, when he said the history of France is embedded in the stones of the Louvre, well, I think we can say that for really, certainly Versailles and for all of the chateaux that have formed part of our series. And we are so grateful not only to you, but to all the presenters of this series who have so generously given of their time and their expertise to inspire us with the history of their chateau. And I'd also like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us the past 11 weeks. But in closing, I pass the word to David Horn, who has a few words to say.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you, Bertrand. I'm so sorry to say that this is the last of our Chateau series and visits. So we're all going to have to be content, as Russell says, to think upon our future travels when we can visit these beautiful places in person. But what a time we have had, n'est-ce pas? 10 chateaux and 10 erudite speakers and storytellers, close to 200 participants each week, and the one and only Russell, who set the tone with an overview of 1,000 years of French history in his introduction. So I would now like to invite you all to unmute yourselves down the left-hand corner and join me in giving our star, Russell and Bertrand, a round of applause for them.
C'était superbe.
And also,
C'était super, merci.
Merci, bravo. Merci à l'Alliance Française aussi.
Bien.
Bravo.
Merci tout le monde. Merci.
Merci à tout le monde.